You. All right, you're off. You're good to go.
So good afternoon. My name is Carrie Sasportis, and I'm the Outreach and Chemical Policy Analyst at the Massachusetts Office of Technical Assistance, which is otherwise known as OTA. So today I'd like to give you an overview and a framework for what we'll be covering in this session. So we'll start with some background information about climate hazards and assessing climate vulnerabilities. We'll talk about mapping tools and resources to help with evaluating risk. We'll also touch on building partnerships with the local community and also regulations that are relevant to emergency preparedness and chemical safety. We'll also talk about results of a recent survey, which was done regarding chemical safety and climate resiliency. OTA conducted this survey of Tura filers with the help of interns from Worcester Polytech, or WPI. That survey was distributed in September of this year to Tura filers, and it closed at the end of September. So throughout this first part of our session, we'll be also using polling questions. They'll be interspersed to help you engage with the content, to help you think about it as well in the context of your facility or your client's facilities. And then, as Pam mentioned, the second part of the session will be more interactive, and we'll set the scenario for a case study. This will be a hypothetical company, and we'll have you break out into small groups to work through an exercise with those case study materials. And the link to that handout should be in the chat if you don't already have it. After we work through the exercise in small groups, then we'll join back together for a larger group discussion. And that discussion, we want to go through the exercise, but also particularly spend some time focusing on opportunities for toxic use reduction to enhance climate resiliency and improve chemical safety. So just a little bit of background for anyone who's not familiar with OTA. Our services are fully confidential and free. The annual fees that companies covered under Tura or Tura filers pay is what actually supports OTA's work. So we work with companies and help companies identify opportunities for toxic use reduction and for resource conservation. We also help companies to implement options once they've been identified. So essentially our purpose is to promote source reduction to minimize the use of toxics in the state. And that's in the interest of worker health, safety, worker health and safety, public health, and also environmental protection. So you might want to know why we're concerned about climate resiliency and specifically chemicals management. And so the big picture here is really to prevent the risk of industrial accidents and harmful exposures to workers in the community. There have been several recent incidents that have been associated with extreme weather, such as what's pictured here, which is the Arkema chemical plant disaster. This was when Hurricane Harvey had struck Houston in 2017. So in this picture, actually, you can see the remains of refrigerated trucks that had held organic peroxides from the Arkema chemical plant. And organic peroxides need to be kept cold, otherwise they can pose an explosion risk at ambient temperatures. The US Chemical Safety Board had investigated this accident. And this facility was located within both 100-year and 500-year floodplains. And in this particular storm, the extensive flooding and the heavy rainfall exceeded their equipment design elevations, and it caused the plant to lose power. And also they lost backup power that was needed to keep refrigeration systems running. So what happened is that these organic peroxides were moved in refrigerated trucks from the facility, but then those trucks ran out of fuel. And so the fire department actually needed to evacuate the area to prevent injuries to workers and neighbors. And there were first responders that were injured in this incident. So this is really why we're having this discussion on climate resiliency and chemicals management. We are really trying to prepare so that we can prevent industrial accidents like this in Massachusetts. So here are just a couple of examples of recent reports, again, just to get a sense of the big picture. On the left here is a report, the cover of a report from 2021 from the Center for Progressive Reform. And this was about how US EPA can protect the public from hazardous chemical releases that are associated with natural disasters. And also highlighted on the right on this slide is the cover of a US GAO, or Government Accountability Office, report that was released in February of this year. And it's about the risk of climate change on chemical safety, specifically at facilities that are covered under the Risk Management Plan, or RMP program, of the Federal Clean Act. And so these are facilities that use, store, handle hazardous substances under that regulation. These facilities, are the RMP facilities, are required to conduct a risk management plan, and this is really to prevent accidental releases of chemicals in the event of an emergency, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. There's a couple of other reports that were released in November 2021, so a year ago, by EPA, including a safety advisory.
Sorry.
Including a safety advisory on the risks of improper storage of hazardous chemicals at chemical warehouses and also chemical distribution facilities. So if anyone needs those links, we can share those after the presentation. And so we're going to spend just a little bit of time on this slide. It's really just to set the regulatory framework and the context for the regulatory framework for emergency preparedness and chemical safety. I won't go into a lot of detail in this presentation on these regulations, but I do want you to have a sense of the regulatory landscape. And so we'll touch on the federal, state, and local level. So the first several of these, or almost all of these actually, are federal level regulations. So we have several that pertain to chemical management and emergency preparedness. One of the broadest is EPCRA. That acronym stands for Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. And this was authorized by Title III of the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, otherwise known as SARA. And just so you know, throughout this presentation, I'm going to try to spell out the acronyms. So EPCRA was enacted in 1986, and this was a couple of years after the Bhopal incident at a Union Carbide plant in India. And that incident exposed over 500,000 people to leakage of methyl isocyanate gas. So EPCRA has reporting requirements for facilities that handle or store hazardous chemicals, and the implementation of this law also authorized each state to create a SERC, or a State Emergency Response Commission. And then within states, there's also tribal, so TURC, tribal authorities, as well as LEPCs, or local emergency planning committees. So reporting requirements are submitted by these facilities through the Tier 2 program for handling and storage of hazardous chemicals, and also the TRI, or Toxic Release Inventory, for emissions of listed toxic chemicals above threshold use in certain industries. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. The data is available to the public, and EPA has several tools that can help the public visualize and access this data. And so that's the piece, that's the community right to know. The next regulation is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. It's a federal regulation for management of both hazardous and non-hazardous waste from what's called cradle to grave. So that means generation from generation to transportation to treatment and disposal. This law requires contingency plans for the hazardous waste generators. So a contingency plan is a written emergency procedures plan. It describes what actions need to be taken to minimize hazards from fires or explosions, or unplanned releases of hazardous waste or hazardous waste constituents to air, water, and soil. So this contingency plan can be combined with other emergency plans at the facility. There's also checklists and templates from EPA to help companies prepare the elements that are required for these emergency contingency plan. The next federal regulation, SPCC, is the Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasure Rule. And this is actually part of the Federal Clean Water Act's Oil Pollution Prevention Regulation. And there's a portion of this, the FRP, which is the Facility Response Plan, which is a rule that requires certain facilities to submit a response plan to prepare for a worst case scenario of an oil discharge or threat of an oil discharge. And then the next regulation, CFATS, stands for Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standard. This is a unique federal regulatory standard which focuses specifically on high-risk chemical facilities in certain industries with listed chemicals of interest above threshold quantities and concentrations. These facilities are required to develop a security plan to prevent chemical terrorism. And then lastly, which I've mentioned before, or not lastly, second to last, RMP is the Risk Management Program. It's a rule under the Federal Clean Air Act, and that requires certain facilities that are using hazardous substances to develop a risk management plan, focusing on accident prevention and preparing for chemical emergencies that could impact communities in which the facility resides. Notably, in August of this year, August 2022, EPA actually released a proposed rule. It's called Safer Communities by Chemical Accident Prevention. This was out for public comment until the end of October. And this proposed rule aims to add further protections for vulnerable communities from chemical accidents. And these new safeguards include the use of toxic risk reduction techniques, such as identifying safer technologies and chemical alternatives to help make communities safer. And then lastly of the federal regulations is the OSHA Process Safety Management Standard, which addresses the management of hazards associated with processes that use specified hazardous substances above threshold quantities. I also wanted to point out a state regulation that we have, which is the Massachusetts Hazardous Materials Processing Regulation. When it was first promulgated, it was listed under 527 CMR 33. It's now listed at 527 CMR 1. It's a regulation that was promulgated by the Department of Fire Services in Massachusetts after previous incidents of fire and explosion, both in Middleton in 2011 and also Danvers in 2006. And this regulation actually requires some of the elements of, or combines some of the elements of the OSHA Process Safety Management Standard and also EPA RMP, but it doesn't have chemical lists or threshold quantities. Instead, it does a definition of physical and health hazards in the listing of chemicals. And just lastly, I wanted to point out that it's important to be aware of any local regulations where your facility or your client's facilities reside. So just as an example, the town of Bedford, Massachusetts has a local bylaw for the management of hazardous materials that's administered by local fire and local board of health. Some local communities have local flammability storage permits. So it's just good for companies to connect with local officials and also attend local emergency planning committee meetings to stay in regular communication and establish relationships in advance of an emergency. So now we'll switch gears just a little bit and talk about climate hazards. And there's several hazards and also cascading impacts from extreme weather and storms that we could face here in Massachusetts. So extreme weather events could include anything from heavy precipitation or intense storms, hurricanes that can result in flooding, but also could result in emergency shutdowns or infrastructure damage and staffing disruptions and power outages. And chemical storage is an issue if there are chemicals that aren't compatible with water that become exposed to floodwater, or chemicals that are incompatible to be stored next to each other. They could be released and cause a reaction. Intense storms can cause disruption to transportation and evacuation routes. Extreme cold can cause power outages or frozen pipes and HVAC failure. Also, we've seen that the weight of snow on roofs can actually pose a physical risk to a facility, and extreme heat can cause explosion risks. So facilities that rely on cooling, if they lose this ability as a result of power loss, have to think about the chemicals that need to be kept cold in order to prevent explosions. And then As we've seen this year, we had drought conditions this summer, and some communities are still experiencing drought conditions. If a facility relies on water for cooling or in their fire suppression system, that's something else to take under consideration. So another way to think about risk is to do a vulnerability assessment and consider what makes the site or facility located vulnerable to climate change. This can help with prioritizing planning for resiliency. So vulnerability is a factor not just of exposure, but also sensitivity and ability to cope or rebound. So in the context of a manufacturing facility, this could include looking at exposure as elevation from sea level at high tide, or whether the facility is located in a flood zone. Things to think about in terms of sensitivity could include the condition of the buildings on site and how chemicals are stored. The ability to cope can be enhanced by robust emergency preparedness efforts and planning, including conducting exercises. And as I briefly touched on in the last, sorry, I just skipped ahead. As I briefly touched on, it's important to engage with the community in preparedness planning. There's many communities in Massachusetts that are part of the state's Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, or MVP program. And this provides excuse me, grant support to cities and towns for investing in climate change resiliency, and also support for developing action plans for climate adaptation. So your company or companies that you consult with could benefit from meaningful engagement with the local MVP planning work groups. And again, as I mentioned, attending local emergency planning committee meetings to connect with local officials and also representatives of community groups. Getting to know the community where your facility is located can also help you evaluate critical exposure pathways as well as sensitive receptors. And these could include daycares or schools or assisted living facilities, multifamily housing developments, and also environmental justice neighborhoods. And strengthening relationships with community leaders and better understanding of community assets, including hospitals or community-based organizations, can help you identify what factors may actually improve the ability to respond and recover from emergencies. So now we're going to take a break for a minute or two. We have a polling question, and we'll give you a minute to respond, and then we'll briefly talk about the results. So I'll just let you take a minute to read this and respond.
Great. So yeah, so I've launched the poll. Go ahead and read through it and pick whichever elements of the poll apply for you. So with respect to potential impacts of climate change that you've assessed, looks like many of you are saying power outages is something you've paid attention to. That's great. Let me just give it a couple more seconds. If you haven't responded to the poll yet, please do. And all right, I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. So what do you think? What do you think, Carrie?
Yeah, so actually this is interesting that folks have factored in power outages. I'll get into the results in a little bit about our survey that we did with the WPI students, because backup power was a topic that came up, and some of those results did surprise us. But this is great that folks are thinking about this and thinking about planning for these potential impacts.
Great. I'll stop sharing and you can go on then.
Okay. Okay. So one of the things I wanted to mention, we've talked about 100 and 500 year flood maps, which are part of the FEMA flood maps. The data that goes into the FEMA flood maps is largely based on historical data and essentially the climate of the past. So one other resource for you to look at are future climate projections, and these are based on modeling greenhouse gas emission trajectories. So there's two that are commonly used. These trajectories are called representative concentration pathways, or the acronym RCP. There's usually a model for both a moderate and also a high emission or worst case emission scenario. So here's an example of the Resilient Massachusetts mapping tool, which was created during the development of the most recent Massachusetts State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. So this mapping tool has data layers for projected future precipitation, sea level rise, and temperature. If you use this mapping tool, you'll see options to do a moderate scenario, which is RCP 4.5. That's a term that's defined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, as a moderate scenario in which greenhouse gas emissions peak around 2040 and then decline. And there's also a model for a worst case scenario, which is RCP 8.5. And that's basically the highest baseline emissions scenario in which emissions just continue to rise throughout the 21st century without any mitigation efforts. So this is just another resource for you to have in your toolbox, especially when evaluating risk. You want to think about not just the climate of today, but also the climate of the future. And I've touched on this already, but partnerships are really important for you and your company, your facility, to help build climate resiliency. And as a facilitator, OTA can help you connect with facilities, or help connect facilities with local public health and emergency management officials. We can also direct you to your local or regional emergency planning committee to help you start building those partnerships around preparedness and safety in the local community if you haven't started that already. Also, local health officials can refer OTA to work with businesses. And again, we work with companies to promote toxic use reduction, resource conservation, to protect worker safety and health. We can conduct site visits and help manufacturers and businesses reduce their use of toxic chemicals and identify safer alternatives. And also work with companies on safely storing chemicals and ensuring compliance with environmental regulations, and provide other expertise and training in understanding climate vulnerabilities and chemical risk mitigation measures. So there's just a few examples of partnerships on this slide. You can see emergency management and public health at the top of your local fire department, but also at the state level, there's MEMA, which manages the CERC, the State Emergency Response Committee, and they collect the submissions of the Tier 2 reporting. Your local health department, local chambers of commerce, environmental justice organizations, community environmental leaders, are other examples of folks that you can connect with and partner with to enhance your resiliency efforts. So now I just want to, as I mentioned in that first poll question, when we saw the responses, so a number of you indicated that you have considered backup power in your emergency plans. And we'll talk about that a little bit. This fall, OTA had hosted a group of interns from WPI. They helped us survey Tura filers about chemical safety and climate change resiliency. So we had email addresses for 394 of the approximately, I think, around 400 Tura filers. We sent a survey link out to everyone that we had an email address for. We did get 32 email bounce backs, and we went to investigate those. Some of those are businesses that had closed or had staff retirements, but we were able to reach 262 Tura filers. Of those companies that we reached, we had 56 companies that responded to the survey. Just a little bit about the survey. None of the questions were actually obligatory. So there were some questions that respondents left blank if they wanted to. So just in the next 2 slides, I'll highlight some of the results. So one of the preliminary questions we asked is whether companies have evaluated either their current or future climate vulnerability to flooding or sea level rise. There were 40 companies that responded to this question, and we found that 4 companies identified that they're currently in or near flood zone. 1 company had evaluated their elevation relative to current sea level at high tide, and 1 company had evaluated their future flood risk based on climate modeling scenarios. But what was really notable about these survey results, again, this is only a subset of the turf filers that responded and answered this question, but 34 of 40 respondents checked a box that was NA or not applicable. We learned because of the way that we asked this question, not applicable could mean that the company either hadn't evaluated risks or that the company has evaluated the risks and thinks that these conditions don't apply. Another question, it's not shown on this slide, that we asked is about emergency backup generators. So there are 41 companies that responded, and what surprised us is only 34% have backup generators that responded to the survey. And so we asked a few questions on the survey to kind of drill down and gather more detail. Of 13 respondents to the question on what kind of fuel they use for their backup generator, 4 of those responded that they're on natural gas, which we know to be a continuous power source unless there were a disruption in transmission lines. And there were 9 who were either fueled by diesel or propane. And then when we drill down further in these questions, of the 13 respondents, it was well over half responded that they would run out of backup power after 2 days of operation. So we asked another question to better understand the processes and facilities that are dependent on a continuous power source to maintain safe operation or that are critical to safety. And so the options you can see on this slide included emergency ventilation, control of pressure or temperature for process or reaction, pollution control devices, and so forth. For each of these options, there's a little animation there. So for each of these options, respondents were also asked whether they had backup power available for these specific items. And what was really striking about these findings is that for each process or control that was critical to safety, or that they indicated was critical to safety, less than half have backup power available for maintenance of safe operations in the event of power loss. Because we know that extreme weather events and storms can often result in power outages, there's really opportunity here for companies to assess their operations now and prepare to have adequate backup power available to operate safely in future storms that could result in power loss. And then another notable finding that's not shown here is that when companies were asked where their backup generators were or their fuel was stored, there were 14 respondents, and 13 of them indicated that their backup generators of fuel for their generators were stored in the basement or low-lying areas outdoors that are susceptible to flooding. So again, there's another opportunity here for facilities to assess where their safety critical equipment is stored and to plan to move them to higher levels to prevent them from being flooded out in an extreme storm. So we'll pause again for another poll question. And Pam?
Yep, sorry, got it. So right, this poll is asking you which of the following you or your client's facility has created a response plan for. People are starting to respond, thank you. Lots of people saying, yep, leak and release of chemicals is something that you've got a response plan for. Excellent. Let's let it go a few more seconds and then I can stop and share the results. All right, good job. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So what do you think, Carrie?
Yeah, this is great. It's great to see that 60, almost 95% of you that responded to this have thought about release or leaks of chemicals. And these other items here are a couple of things to think about. So if there's a reaction process that could be unstable or could run away, that's something you want to think about. If there's a way to protect that process in the case of an emergency, or loss of temperature or pressure control are things you might want to think about if there's a way to safely shut off some of those activities, and look at your automated systems as well.
And Melanie mentions that they've also done a flood response plan, which is great.
Great.
Okay, I've stopped sharing.
Great, thank you. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about facility emergency checklists and plans. This slide shows some features that are common in facility emergency checklists. There are templates that are available from EPA and also other agencies for certain regulatory programs. And I think these can be easily modified for an individual facility's needs. Something you might want to have is a cover page with critical information up front that has a summary of emergency contacts and special hazards, whether there's an explosion risk or respiratory hazards to workers or responders, whether or not it's okay to shut off the power or gas or water in the event of an emergency, and if so, where those process controls and shutoffs are located. Your cover page could also include a summary of contacts for community notifications and location of sensitive populations in the event of the need for evacuation. In the survey that we did with the WPI students that was sent out to Chura filers, we also asked several questions regarding emergency preparedness plans and the type of information that some of the facility plans contain. So we have 40 respondents to this question, and the majority indicated they have plans that contain the full current inventory and SDSs for chemicals that are used or stored on site. The majority also have procedures for containing a spill or release, which I think is consistent to your responses to the poll. And many have current contact information for local emergency responders or local boards of health. Many also indicated that their plans address the maintenance, storage, testing, and availability of personal protective equipment, which is a great thing. But we did learn that less than half of those respondents indicated that their plans address things like emergency communication equipment, things like radios or walkie-talkies if the cell service or landlines are down. So what you want to think about there is if you have these devices, doing maintenance and testing periodically. Less than half of the respondents indicated that they're storing PPE in a location that would remain clean and dry in the case of flooding, or even if they had a list of vendors that they could try in the event that there was a supply chain disruption. So that's also something to think about, is where your PPE is stored. And less than half had emergency staffing plans if emergency conditions cause staffing disruptions or transportation disruptions. So even if some of this information isn't part of a regulatory requirement in your plans, you may want to include it. There are a number of lessons learned specifically about staffing and supply chain disruptions during the COVID pandemic that I think can be applied to your emergency facility plans for extended emergencies, including natural disasters. So just to recap our discussion on evaluating risks, we need to understand the properties and hazards of the chemical, whether there's a person and whether there's a potential for a person to come into contact or be exposed to a chemical. We've talked a little bit about sensitive receptors to exposures. such as children in schools or daycares, residents of assisted living and long-term care facilities, and also environmental justice neighborhoods. And these are neighborhoods where residents have historically and currently have borne a disproportionate burden to cumulative environmental exposures. We can also evaluate climate hazards related to a facility's location and whether there's more opportunity for people to become exposed to the chemicals if there's severe weather and there's a leakage or release. So you want to think about looking at chemical storage and thinking about appropriate containment, secondary containment in the case of a flood, and whether chemicals stored next to each other are compatible. And again, OTA's main goal is to focus on toxicity reduction as a primary method of reducing the risk of climate-related chemical safety hazards. And the thinking is that reducing the use of a toxic chemical using TUR methods like input substitution or product reformulation can reduce the amount of chemicals that are stored on site. And this is something that we'll have an opportunity to work through in your case study. And I wanted to point out some of the tools and resources that I've referenced. OTA has a number of resources on our website on chemical safety and climate change preparedness. These resources include a video about preventing potential climate change related chemical accidents. We have an interactive mapping tool, which you'll have a chance to use in the case study. And it's also shown in this slide. Our mapping tool allows users to overlay climate vulnerability factors like flood risk and also social vulnerability factors such as environmental justice neighborhoods and chemical use factors, such as large-scale toxics users, but also facilities that are covered under other federal regulations, including TRI and Tier 2. There's also a link in our mapping tool to the Resilient Mass website, which is the tool that I showed you to access future climate projections. So these are available at the link on this slide. And now we have another polling question.
Okay, so I'm launching this poll. This is a different kind of poll from what you're used to seeing. So I want you to make sure that you have scrolled down to see A through F as options. The poll is asking, where do you see the most opportunity for incorporating climate resiliency into your TUR planning efforts? We're going to give this a little bit more time just because you want to be thinking about it. How might you be able to connect your toxic waste reduction planning to preparing to be more resilient to extreme weather events or whatever? So it's good. You guys are doing great. A lot of different answers. It'll be interesting to walk through this together and see what your responses are. You know, where do you see absolutely no opportunities? Where do you see minimal? Where do you see some? Where do you see the most opportunity for addressing climate resiliency within your TUR planning? Let me just give it another few seconds, see if you can all complete this. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. And Carrie, what do you think about what you're seeing here?
Yeah, this is definitely interesting and something we can dig into a little bit more in our larger group discussion. It looks like some or most folks have thought about this in the context of feasibility evaluation of options and management policy, employee engagement. Looks like there's a little less opportunity in implementation scheduling. So yeah, this is great. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, good. All right.
So now we're going to launch into our case study. And I'll set it up just with some background information, and then we'll have you break out into small groups. So in the next couple of slides, I'll walk through a hypothetical scenario, and you can refer to your handout. It will have most of these details, and it'll also have a list of the exercise steps or questions. So our hypothetical company is called Best Rest Incorporated, and Best Rest is a polyurethane foam manufacturer. They're located in Lynn, Massachusetts on Hanson Street, and they produce flexible polyurethane foam for the bedding and furniture market. Their production process for polyurethane foam involves 5 main ingredients. So the Best Rest manufacturing facility operates in a single-story building with a basement. The production zone is located on the first level of the facility. Chemical storage is also located at the other end of the first level, which is adjacent to the loading dock and the outside loading entrance. The mechanical room is located on the basement level, and there's boilers and a machinery room with compressors for an anhydrous ammonia system. And there's ammonia detection sensors located in the basement level, as well as manual emergency ventilation switches. So this is not meant to be a process flow diagram. It's just meant to illustrate the ingredients that they use. And so the production process uses 2,4-toluene diisocyanate, which reacts with a polyether polyol. Triethylamine catalyst is used to control the reaction rate, and a silicone copolymer is used as a stabilizer to control the cell size of the foam, and water is used as a blowing agent to create the foam's porous structure. This is just another illustration. These 5 ingredients are injected under pressure, and the components react in a mold, which generates quite a bit of heat. So anhydrous ammonia is used to cool and solidify the product. So now we'll break into small groups and work through this case study. And as I mentioned, there's 5 steps. So what I think would be helpful is each, when everybody arrives in your virtual breakout rooms, if each group could identify one person to act as a timekeeper, we'll have 30 minutes for this exercise. And then if you also wouldn't mind nominating a second person to report back to a larger group when we convene again. And please plan to spend about an average of 6 minutes on each question, just to make sure you can work through all the steps in the 30 minutes that we have.
Right. Okay, so thanks, Carrie. So I have posted the document itself in the chat, and I've also put a link to our website where you can download that document from our materials associated with this conference. So make sure that you've had a chance to do that before you go into your breakout room. If you absolutely can't figure it out, more than likely there's going to be a couple other people in your group who have. But there's a lot to this breakout small group work. So it's best to have that in front of you when you go into your breakout groups. If somebody could share their screen to show the handout, that would probably be helpful as well. So I'm going to go ahead and break you out. This is going to be about a half an hour in small groups. Carrie and Liz and I will pop around and just see how you're doing. I will give you a 5-minute warning, and then I will, you'll get a 1-minute warning before all of the breakout rooms close down, and we'll come back to the larger group. Before we do that, are there any questions?
Pam, have you allowed screen sharing within the groups? That was disallowed during a previous session.
Okay, I don't know about that, but I will make sure that that is allowed. Thanks for letting me know. Any other questions, folks? Okay. All right, I'm going to send you out into your breakout groups of about 5 or 6 people each.
Hello.
Hey, Ken, how are you doing?
Back.
All right, welcome back, everybody. So Liz and I were kind of hopping into different rooms over the course of this, and it was interesting to see how you all were doing. Carrie, where are you? There you are.
Yep.
You're a face among faces, which is wonderful. All right, well, go ahead. Let's hear what people found and learned and thought.
Okay. So I think what I'll have folks do is there are a number of small groups, so we can't have everyone participating. But if one or two groups want to speak up and just let us know how you answered this first question about the listed chemicals.
Yeah, I can go on that. So this is Scott from Group 5. So we found 3 to our listed chemicals. We found anhydrous ammonia, CAS 7664417. We found triethylamine as also as a to our listed chemical. And the last one, the 2,4-toluene diisocyanate, is not only a listed chemical, it's also a high hazard substance.
Great.
Nice.
Thank you.
Did anybody find anything different?
No.
Nope.
Okay.
The only thing different is that the silicone copolymer was not very well defined. So we don't know what the other part of that might have been. So there's a possibility if you had the specific SDS for that, it might be.
Really good point.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback.
I love when people say things like that. It just points out how on the ball you guys are. So keep it going.
So for the second step, this question asks you to identify the chemical hazards and risks, and whether or not there's a potential for an unintended reaction, and what potentially the health impacts are from exposure. So is there another group that wants to volunteer?
So, Dylan from Group 4. So, going through the chemicals. So we have the 2,4-toluene diisocyanate. Some of them, with health, with respect to health and safety, we notice, fatal on contact, risk of cancer there, fatal if inhaled, which really stuck out to me, and also, harmful to the aquatic ecosystem. So there's with respect to storing of it, and they work. I'm kind of jumping ahead, but when they're with respect to where they're stored, right? I mean, it's probably not, the best. The triethylamine, again, another one, toxic if in contact, and then the ammonia. I mean, it reacts with water. Can potentially explode, react with, can ignite rapidly. So yeah, those are some of the things we pointed out with those.
What about physical hazards? Did somebody else, were there some specific physical hazards that you identified?
I think this is Kathy, Group 7. The TDI can react exothermically with water. So we identified that, and then the chain of reactions that could happen in the event of flooding in the area, became a large part of that discussion, and then how to protect the area.
Right.
TDI, this is Larry. TDI is also a problem from a inhalation standpoint. I've seen people who are extremely sensitive to it, and you've got a Walmart basically next door to it. So if fumes got out, that could be an issue.
Oh, such a good point. Really, really good point. Yeah, if anybody's familiar with that, that the TDI can be really hyper sensitizing. And so once somebody gets sensitized to it, they can't be within a ppm of it without having an impact, having an effect. So yeah, really good point.
We also found on our team that the TDI can explode if heated, so it requires ventilation. And the ammonia, if the power is lost, they could also have an explosion. So there's power issues there too.
Mm-hmm. And these are all really important things to be thinking about when you're doing your TUR planning and you're characterizing your process and you're thinking about where opportunities. When you're looking at it from this lens, there's suddenly more of a reason to prioritize some of these chemicals because they may present more of a risk. Prioritize them with respect to finding safer alternatives. Go ahead, Carrie. I'm sorry, I keep jumping in.
Oh, that's okay. One thing I wanted to add before we move on from this particular question with regard to anhydrous ammonia. Anhydrous is something that's kept under very intense pressure to keep it as a gas as opposed to a liquid. And so there were clues throughout this case study with regard to where controls were located for the cooling system. They were in the basement, and this is potentially, we'll get into the next question, but just something to think about is where your systems and where your equipment's located on your physical site. And then I think that's a good segue into the next question, unless anyone has anything else to add here.
Go ahead.
If I could just a couple more things. We could go back to that slide just for a second. I'm sorry, I just wanted to give everybody a chance to say something. In terms of flammability, the triethanolamine is a very low flash point. So there are lots of issues with that. If you can have short circuits in the beginning. One of the thing I know, because one of the clients I work with who works with TDI and reaction vessels, is it gets very hot. It's very exothermic when it's reacting. So they have cooling jackets on their reaction vessels to cool it down to keep the temperature to a certain point, slow the reaction, now that the heat build up. So if they lost power, they do have an emergency generator, but the emergency generator is at ground level. So if they did have flooding there, that wouldn't really take care of that issue. The other, talking about anhydrous ammonia, I have two clients who use anhydrous ammonia for different reasons. They both have huge anhydrous ammonia tanks that were put in probably 30, 40 years ago. And when you do basic cameo modeling and you look at where these companies are located, the potential receptors in the neighborhood, because again, some of these companies, it's not 100 feet until you're into residential areas. So if you had a smaller tank giveaway versus a larger tank, you reduce the potential for exposure and death. I kind of see that as a toxic use reduction thing to do. And then also from process redesign or modernization, sometimes, especially in surface treatment with anhydrous ammonia, there are steps that are duplicative that were written 30, 40 years ago. A lot of these companies, we've always done it that way. But if you really look at it, some of the preliminary steps with anhydrous ammonia can be reduced and or eliminated. That's something I keep trying to push through. So in terms of toxic use reduction, I think those are some things to look at too.
Really good additions. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's excellent, and why we're having this discussion. So thank you.
Sure.
So in step 3, we move on to talk about some of the climate hazards for this site location. And so we asked you to do a little bit of investigation with OTA's mapping tool. So I hope you're all able to access that and play around with the tool a little bit. I can do just a couple of static images of looking up this site location and looking at different aspects of, potential hazards related to flooding. But I'm curious to see what everyone came up with. And anyone can jump in here.
Go ahead.
Well, we obviously saw that it was in a flood zone. I asked, but wasn't able to find the question or the answer whether it was near any schools or nursing homes or hospitals. But that would all be a concern as well.
Looked like Walmart was well protected, Walter.
Was.
It was,
Of course.
it's right, right, Amanda. It wasn't in the zone, right?
Yeah, so the Walmart was above the flood zone that we were looking at, and we were trying to figure out why.
Yeah, also keep in mind that these the data sources for these are mostly FEMA or NOAA for the sea level rise. So these could be based on historical data, so things could be changing. And so the other mapping tool that I showed you, Resilient Mass, may be another strategy to kind of explore around this.
What under hurricane surge, are you looking at flooding or high winds or both in that situation?
So I honestly can't recall, but one of the things you can do with this mapping tool is the data layer itself. When you click on the data layer and you go to the right of the name of the data layer, there's 3 dots. And if you click on that, it will, you can go to the page that has the source data for the map, and that will give you all the metadata in terms of what they're actually measuring.
Carrie,
But-
one of the groups was asking about whether or not that mapping tool can layer on EJ communities.
Yes, so you
Yeah.
can. And so this is another screenshot of the environmental justice communities mapped onto this site. So I know that you know it will take a lot of time for people to explore this a little bit more, and you know you can certainly do that on your own after this presentation, and feel free to contact us and ask us any questions. There is an infrastructure layer, and that does have the layer that has the Massachusetts environmental justice neighborhoods as defined by the 2020 statute.
It's funny that screenshot that you're showing, it looks like it's just showing a minority status.
Yeah,
the
and
area?
actually that's a great point. And so things are in flux, and there is the governor appointed environmental justice council is looking they're tasked with looking at the definition of an
Right.
environmental justice neighborhood, and so these things do change over time.
Well, I'm just saying
when
that on the active map, it's minority and income.
Correct. Yeah, and
Okay.
and that's because the map itself is up to date. But this particular screenshot I took a little bit earlier. So this screenshot is a little bit out of date.
Dave, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Not really. I mean, they've covered pretty much everything we looked at. Again, with the ammonia storage being in the basement, that's probably not the best idea. The cyanide reactions, isocyanate reactions, I play with cyanide. We had a cyanide explosion when I was at Stern Leach. I wasn't there the day it happened. I wasn't in control of that, but I know they can take they can do runaway reactions, so they need cooling. So it's sort of a critically balanced system. So when you plan for that type of operation, you would have to plan for that. I mean, it's not something I'd want to do for a living, you know, in terms of the chemical procedures. And I'm a chemist, I'd be looking at that thinking, I probably want to find a job someplace else. But it's, you know, people have to do certain things, and that's it.
Right.
But it's interesting, and it's one of these things that I would definitely do some planning or better planning on. I was commented in my group that we do play with anhydrous ammonia. We make ammonium hydroxide, and we sell that to the power industries for electric utilities for NOx reduction. So it's a chemical that's, you know, it's considered critical infrastructure. But my ammonia, the bulk of it's on a rail car, and we have a rail yard upgrade, well upgrade of our facility. And so we can just move the rail car. And being a dock in the 1938 hurricane, they established a lot of hurricane barriers and hurricane walls. And a lot of our chemicals, the bulk storage chemicals, are in dikes, berms. So we could take a pretty good hit.
Oh, that's really good to hear. I've been curious about that for you in particular, because you're right in Fall River, right on the water.
Right on the water, yeah. we can move, I mean, being a trucking company, I mean, I was looking at your regulations. We have a dam on site, which I never knew we had, but we're covering the dam regulations to make my life a little more interesting. Plus, with the rail yard, we're Federal Railroad Administration. Plus, beyond CFATs, we have maritime security. So I've got a parade of regulators come in there all the time, and everybody's got, you know, critiques and everything else, and we're just running around, you know, just keeping up with everything. But in an event, we can, you know, load stuff on box trucks and take them off site and bring them up, upgrade. We'll upgrade, like I said, the rail yard, we can load the rail cars, upgrade, much like that. And then the with the rail, I mean, the diking and stuff like that, we could take a pretty good hit. The 38 Hurricane with the seawall, we have hurricane pumps, but they're dysfunctional because we haven't had to use them in eons. But if we had to restore them back to you know, operations, it would take a bit, but we could do it. And also we have our outfalls. They were provided with gates, share gates, so we can close the outfalls if we had to, so we weren't taken in. The share gates are in disrepair too, but again, they can be restored. You know, if we're looking at extreme weathers as a rule coming up in the future, we can look at something and upgrade the system or restore it back to the Hurricane 38 paranoia. But the big deal is we have a seawall and our buildings tend to be upgraded and are high. You know, so we're walking to one of our buildings, you go beyond the dock, you have to go up a staircase. We just put, you know, higher grades.
Yeah, smart.
I have a question. First of all, it says that the anhydrous ammonia is used to cool and solidify the product. And that is after it says that it is injected under pressure and into a mold. I think the ammonia cools the mold and cools the final product, the foam. I think that the reactor with the TDI and the polyol is probably water cooled. And this whole hypothetical scenario doesn't mention that.
Thank you for the feedback.
Yeah, just it was a little ambiguous as to whether the reactor itself was water cooled or ammonia cooled. And my guess is that it's way too expensive to cool the reactor with ammonia. They probably cool it with water and then solidify the product in the mold cooled by the anhydrous ammonia. My biggest concern in this whole thing is that the ammonia detection sensors are located in the basement and are manually operate the emergency ventilation. So if there's a catastrophic leak, the compressors for the ammonia are in the basement. If there's a catastrophic leak, nobody's going to get to those manual ventilators. And if there's a minor leak, you're still going to have people at risk before they get to identify and turn on the manual ventilators. Those should be automatically operated through the ammonia detectors.
Right. So a good opportunity to incorporate some operation and maintenance and process modernization into your TUR planning.
Yeah, I think that was a good segue into our last question, which is really about TUR strategies and TUR options for making upgrades here and making this facility more climate resilient.
So we have 2 minutes, Carrie. Do you want to, is there anything else on there? Any other TUR opportunities that folks want to kind of mention before we move on?
Okay.
This is Walter. I think some foams these days, especially in the automotive industry, are being made out of less toxic materials. I think like soy is one of them. So, you know, maybe there are opportunities to change the process completely and get rid of all these nasty chemicals.
Yeah. Or at least some of them.
Right.
Yeah, and that's something in this exercise is that this company is a polyurethane foam manufacturer, but they're making these products for bedding and furniture. So I think that's a great point, is that, you know, they can reformulate, they can change the product that they're making. use less toxic alternatives and still serve that market.
Great example, Carrie.
Yeah, so I just wanted to end with another plug for OTA. Our staff includes chemists and engineers and public health officials, and we can help companies find alternatives to using toxic chemicals. We assist with toxic use reduction and climate resiliency. We're certainly available as follow-up after this presentation to help assist you. We assist with environmental compliance and energy efficiency and resource conservation. So please feel free to reach out to us and contact us. And then my contact information is here on this last slide. And I wanted to thank everyone for joining us.
Yeah, really great discussions. Good work. Any last questions for Carrie before you go? Nope. Good. Carrie, thank you so much. This was a great presentation. Thank you all for participating. It was really good discussion.
Thank you.
Have a great day, folks.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Great job.
Bye.